My daughter-in-law's smirk cut through the courtroom like a blade as my son limped to his seat. But when the judge lifted his gaze and saw me walking behind James, he froze mid-motion. His eyes widened in recognition, and he whispered loud enough for the front row to hear, "Helena, why are you here?" The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. Wanda Bennett's polished mask cracked. Her lawyer's pen stopped mid-signature. Even her parents, sitting in the second row with their practiced superiority, exchanged panicked glances. I was glad they were afraid. They should be. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far it has reached. The wooden doors had barely closed when Judge Robert Franklin took his seat at the bench. His presence commanded immediate respect, a man who'd spent 30 years weighing lives in the balance. His sharp eyes swept the room with practiced authority, pausing briefly on James with what looked like pity. Then his gaze landed on me. He blinked. Once. Twice. His composed expression shattered. I moved forward with deliberate calm, my pearl necklace catching the overhead lights. My heels echoed against the marble floor, each step a countdown. I placed my worn leather briefcase on the defense table. The sound cracked through the room like a judge's gavel. Thud. A declaration. I pulled out the chair beside my son and sat down. James's hand trembled beneath mine, cold and uncertain. The room held its breath. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. A lawyer in the gallery coughed nervously. Judge Franklin leaned forward, his knuckles white against the bench. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, a ghost of disbelief threading through every syllable. "Helena Gilbert, why are you here?" That question rippled through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Whispers erupted. Wanda's eyes narrowed, darting between me and the judge, trying to decode what she'd missed. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. Her father's jaw tightened. James turned to me, confusion flooding his weary face, but beneath it, something fragile and desperately hopeful flickered to life. He didn't know. None of them knew. I wasn't just James Bennett's mother. I had been someone else. Someone this city once knew by name and reputation. Someone they called the iron voice of justice, before they tried to bury me beneath lies and silence. But silence, I'd learned, wasn't defeat. It was preparation. The October sky had been heavy with clouds, the kind that pressed down on Chicago like a held breath. I stood outside the courthouse beside our car, steadying James as he maneuvered out with his cane. His body moved stiffly, each step a painful reminder of the fire that had stolen his strength, his company, and nearly his will to fight. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You don't have to come inside. It's just paperwork." Paperwork. The word landed like ash in my mouth. I gripped his arm firmly, feeling the tremor beneath his sleeve. When the law becomes a weapon, James, paperwork can kill faster than bullets. He looked at me then, really looked, searching my face for something he couldn't quite name. I saw myself reflected in his eyes, a woman of 72 with silver hair pinned elegantly back, pearl earrings catching the gray light, a tailored charcoal suit that had survived 2 decades in the back of my closet. I looked like someone's dignified grandmother. I was anything but. "I don't understand," he murmured. "What can you do? You're not." He stopped himself, but I heard the unspoken words, "You're not a lawyer anymore." "No," I said softly. "I'm not. But I remember how to be." The crowd gathering near the courthouse steps barely glanced at us, their cold indifference like winter fog. A young woman in a business suit rushed past, nearly colliding with James's cane. She didn't apologize. No one did anymore. The world had learned to look past the wounded, the broken, the inconvenient. Somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled, slow, mournful, relentless. Each chime struck my chest like a countdown. I gripped my old briefcase tighter, feeling its cracked leather edges press into my palm. 20 years ago, I'd thrown this case into the back of a storage unit and sworn I'd never touch it again. Last week, I'd pulled it out, blown off the dust, and filled it with documents that would either save my son or condemn us both. This case didn't just hold papers. It held everything: my son's future, my family's honor, and the ghost of a woman I thought I'd never become again. "Mom, please," James whispered as we approached the entrance. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me. Not again." I stopped walking. The rain had begun, light, almost imperceptible, but enough to blur the edges of the world around us. "James," I said, meeting his eyes. "I didn't sacrifice myself 20 years ago. They tried to take me. There's a difference. And if they try again?" I smiled then, a small, dangerous thing. "Then they'll remember why they were afraid the first time." The moment we entered, I felt the shift in atmosphere, like stepping into a cathedral where judgment hung heavier than incense. The plaintiff's table was already occupied. Wanda sat flanked by her parents and her attorney, a man in his early 40s with the kind of expensive watch that screamed new money trying to look old. His name, I'd learned from James, was Marcus Dunfield, a corporate litigation specialist who'd built his reputation on crushing small business owners in divorce proceedings. He was good at making people disappear on paper. So was I. Once. Wanda herself looked every inch the wounded wife: cream-colored suit, minimal makeup to emphasize her suffering, a silk handkerchief clutched in one hand like a prop. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, calculated casualness designed to make her look both beautiful and broken. When she saw James enter, her expression shifted subtly. A flash of something cold passed through her eyes before settling back into practiced sympathy. Then she saw me. Her eyes widened. Just slightly. Just enough. "Who is that?" I heard her mother hiss. Wanda's lips pressed into a thin line. "His mother." The way she said it, like I was an inconvenience, a relic, something to be tolerated, made my blood simmer. But I kept my face neutral. In courtrooms, emotion was currency. I wouldn't spend mine cheaply. I helped James to his seat, then deliberately placed my briefcase on the table between us. The leather was worn but dignified, like a scar that had healed but never forgotten. Marcus Dunfield glanced at it, then at me, his expression mildly curious but dismissive. First mistake, I thought. Never dismiss the quiet ones. All rise. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. Everyone stood. Judge Robert Franklin entered through the side door, his black robes flowing behind him like authority-made fabric. He was older than I remembered, grayer, heavier around the shoulders, but his eyes still held that sharp, uncompromising intelligence. He settled into his seat, adjusting his glasses, and opened the case file. His expression was neutral, professional, practiced. Then he looked up. His gaze swept the plaintiff's table first: Wanda, her parents, Marcus Dunfield, all of them poised and prepared. Then his eyes shifted to our side. To James, slumped slightly in his chair, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. And then, to me. The world stopped. I saw the exact moment recognition hit him. His eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly. The file slipped from his fingers, papers scattering across the bench. Helena. The word escaped him like a prayer and a curse combined. "Helena Gilbert, why are you here?" The courtroom erupted into whispers. Marcus Dunfield frowned, leaning toward Wanda. "Who the hell is Helena Gilbert?" Wanda's face had gone pale. She didn't answer. But her father did. His voice was low, tight with something that might have been fear. "She's the woman who took down half the Cook County judiciary 20 years ago." Judge Franklin recovered quickly, decades of courtroom experience snapping back into place like armor. He cleared his throat, gathering the scattered papers with forced composure. "Counselors," he said, his voice steadier now. "Approach the bench." Marcus Dunfield rose smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket. He shot me a curious glance as he passed, trying to measure me, categorize me, file me away as irrelevant. I didn't move. James leaned close. Mom, what's happening? Justice, I whispered. Finally. At the bench, I could see Marcus speaking in low tones, gesturing toward me. Judge Franklin's expression remained unreadable, but I caught the subtle shake of his head, a warning, perhaps, or a refusal. When Marcus returned, his confidence had dimmed. Just slightly. Judge Franklin's gaze found mine across the courtroom. For a moment, we were no longer judge and observer, but teacher and student separated by 2 decades of silence. He'd been a clerk in my final case. A young man fresh from law school, idealistic and hungry for truth. He'd watched them destroy me. Watched them strip my license, drag my name through editorials and ethics hearings, paint me as corrupt because I'd dared to expose the rot beneath the robes. And he'd said nothing. Not because he was complicit, but because he was powerless. Now he sat on the bench those corrupt men once occupied. And I sat where the accused once trembled. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of us. This court is now in session, Judge Franklin announced, his voice carrying the weight of ritual. Case number 2025, DR 4782, Bennett v. Bennett, petition for dissolution of marriage and division of assets. He paused, his eyes finding mine once more. Before we proceed, I must note for the record the presence of Mrs. Helena Gilbert in the gallery. He stopped himself. Correction. Mrs. Gilbert is seated at the defense table. Marcus Dunfield stood immediately. Your Honor, with all due respect, Mrs. Gilbert is not listed as counsel of record. If she intends to represent. She doesn't, I said calmly, rising to my feet. Every eye in the courtroom turned to me. I'm here, I continued, my voice steady and clear, as a witness. And as a mother. Judge Franklin's jaw tightened. Mrs. Gilbert, you understand that? I understand perfectly, Your Honor. I met his gaze without flinching. I haven't practiced law in 20 years. I'm not here to argue motions or cross-examine witnesses. I'm here to ensure my son receives what the law promises but rarely delivers. And what's that? Marcus asked, his tone dripping with condescension. I turned to him slowly, letting the silence stretch. The truth. Marcus Dunfield's opening statement was exactly what I expected, polished, rehearsed, and emotionally manipulative. He painted James as a broken man, unable to work, unable to provide, unable to function as a husband. He presented medical reports documenting James's injuries from the fire, psychological evaluations suggesting depression and dependency. Mrs. Bennett, Marcus said, gesturing toward Wanda with practiced sympathy, has shown extraordinary patience and compassion. She stood by her husband through months of recovery, sacrificing her own career to care for him. But there comes a point when compassion becomes self-destruction. Wanda dabbed at her eyes with the silk handkerchief. I watched her carefully. The tears were real enough, glycerin drops, most likely, applied moments before entering the courtroom. But it was the way she held herself that betrayed her, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, eyes scanning the room to measure the impact of her performance. She wasn't a grieving wife. She was an actress waiting for applause. My client, Marcus continued, is simply asking for what she's entitled to under Illinois law, an equitable division of marital assets. The home they purchased together. The investments made during their marriage. The security she deserves as she begins to rebuild her life. Together. During. Deserves. Each word was a carefully constructed lie. I opened my briefcase quietly, pulling out a single folder. Inside were property deeds, bank statements, and transaction records going back 7 years. James glanced at the folder, then at me. What is that? The truth, I whispered. In triplicate. When Marcus finished his opening, Judge Franklin turned to our table. Mr. Bennett, do you wish to make an opening statement? James started to rise, but I placed a hand on his arm. Your Honor, I said, standing instead. If I may address the court briefly, not as counsel, but as a concerned party with relevant information. Marcus shot to his feet. Objection. Mrs. Gilbert has no standing to. Overruled. Judge Franklin's voice was quiet but absolute. I'll allow it. Briefly, Mrs. Gilbert. I stepped forward, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented a narrative of sacrifice and compassion. He's painted my son as helpless and my daughter-in-law as selfless. But narratives, as you and I both know, are only as honest as the evidence that supports them. I placed the folder on the edge of the defense table. The home Mr. Dunfield referenced as purchased together was bought 5 years before James and Wanda's marriage. Every down payment, every mortgage payment, every property tax bill was paid from my son's account alone. The deed bears his name. Solely. Marcus's expression tightened. Your Honor, this is improper. The investments made during their marriage, I continued, my voice rising just enough to carry authority, include a life insurance policy on my son taken out by Mrs. Bennet 3 weeks before a warehouse fire destroyed his business. The same fire that left him unable to walk without assistance. The courtroom went utterly silent. Wanda's face had gone ashen. Her mother clutched her father's arm. Judge Franklin leaned forward. Mrs. Gilbert, that's a serious allegation. It's not an allegation, Your Honor. I looked directly at Wanda. It's a fact. And I have the insurance documents to prove it. For the first time since we'd entered the courtroom, Wanda's mask slipped completely. Her eyes blazed with something raw and desperate, not grief, but fear. She leaned toward Marcus, whispering urgently. He shook his head, trying to regain control. Judge Franklin raised his hand. Mrs. Gilbert, if you have evidence pertinent to this case, it needs to be submitted through proper channels. This isn't the time. With respect, Your Honor, when is the time? I asked quietly. When my son has already lost his home? When he's been stripped of everything he built because we waited for proper channels to protect him? Judge Franklin's jaw worked. I could see the war behind his eyes, the judge bound by procedure, and the man who remembered what happened when procedure was weaponized. I'll review any evidence you wish to submit, he said finally. But this hearing will proceed according to the rules of this court. Of course, Your Honor. I inclined my head respectfully. I wouldn't expect anything less. But as I sat back down, I caught Judge Franklin's gaze one last time. And in that look, I saw what I needed. I remember. I believe you. But you have to prove it. As Marcus Dunfield called his first witness, Wanda herself, James leaned close to me, his voice barely audible. Mom, what are you doing? I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Wanda as she rose gracefully, smoothing her skirt, preparing to perform. Finishing what I started 20 years ago, I whispered back. And what's that? I finally turned to meet his eyes. Reminding them that the law doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the deepest pocket. It belongs to the truth. And the truth, I glanced at Wanda, now settling into the witness stand with rehearsed elegance, has been very patient. As Wanda placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, I opened my briefcase once more. Inside, beneath the property deeds and insurance documents, was a small digital recorder. And on that recorder was Wanda's voice, captured 1 week ago, saying the words that would end her charade forever. Once James signs everything over, I'll be gone by summer. Victor already found a buyer for the house. We can start fresh in California. I didn't play it. Not yet. Timing, I'd learned long ago, was everything. Judge Franklin caught my eye as Wanda began her testimony. His expression was carefully neutral, but I saw the question there. Do you really have what you claim? I closed the briefcase with a soft click. And smiled. Wanda's voice floated through the courtroom like honey laced with arsenic, sweet, smooth, and utterly poisonous. I loved him, she said from the witness stand, her eyes glistening with practiced tears. I still do. But James isn't the man I married. The accident changed him. He became distant. Angry. Dependent. I watched her performance with the detachment of someone who'd seen 1,000 liars take the stand. She was good, better than most. She knew exactly when to pause, when to dab her eyes, when to let her voice crack just enough to seem vulnerable without appearing weak. Marcus Dunfield guided her through the narrative with surgical precision, building a case not just against James's competence, but against his very worth as a human being. But I wasn't listening to the words anymore. I was remembering. The courtroom had been different then. Older, darker, thick with the smell of old wood and older secrets. I stood at the defense table, 42 years old and at the height of my career, holding a folder that would either make me a hero or destroy my life. I chose truth. The folder contained bank records, wire transfers, and taped phone conversations proving that 3 judges in Cook County were selling verdicts to the highest bidder. Cases involving millions of dollars, custody battles, criminal sentences, all decided not by law, but by laundered money and backroom deals. I'd spent 18 months gathering the evidence, working with a federal investigator named Martin Cruz. We'd been careful, methodical, certain that the system would protect us if we followed the rules. We were wrong. The moment I submitted the evidence, the machine turned against me. Within a week, the investigator was transferred. Within 2 weeks, my bank accounts were frozen for suspicious activity. Within a month, ethics complaints appeared, anonymous, detailed, and entirely fabricated. By the end of the year, I was disbarred. The official reason: conflict of interest and mishandling of client funds. The real reason: I'd exposed men who owned the very system designed to judge them. My husband, Richard, left 3 months after the disbarment. Not because he believed the lies, but because he couldn't handle the truth, that standing for justice sometimes meant losing everything else. You had a choice, he'd said the day he packed his bags. You chose your pride over your family. I'd watched him leave, holding 18-month-old James in my arms, and thought, no. I chose my son's future. I chose a world where he might grow up believing the law still means something. Even if I had to lose everything to give him that chance. I raised James alone in a small apartment on the south side, working 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Legal consulting under the table. Paralegal work. Teaching night classes at community college. The law degree they'd stripped from me couldn't erase what I knew. James grew up watching me work late into the night, surrounded by books and case files, teaching myself new fields because the old ones were closed to me. He learned discipline by watching me refuse to break. He learned empathy by seeing me help neighbors with their legal problems for free, guiding them through systems designed to chew up people like us. Mom, he'd asked me once, maybe 10 years old, sitting at our kitchen table while I reviewed a tenants' rights case, why do you still do this? If they took away your license, why do you still help people? I'd looked up from the paperwork, seeing his young face so full of genuine confusion. Because justice doesn't need a license, James. It just needs people willing to fight for it. He nodded, not fully understanding, but absorbing the lesson anyway. By the time he was 25, he'd built his own construction company from nothing, just like I'd taught him. Hard work. Honest dealing. Treating people with dignity even when the world told you they didn't matter. I'd never been prouder. The day James brought Wanda home, I knew. Not the specifics. Not the depth of her deception. But I knew the way you know when a case has a hidden angle, when a witness's testimony is too perfect, too rehearsed. She was beautiful, objectively, undeniably so. Blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold, a smile that could warm a room, and manners that spoke of finishing schools and country clubs. Everything about her screamed right choice for a successful young contractor climbing into Chicago's upper middle class. But her eyes never matched her smile. I watched her that first dinner, sitting across from me in my modest dining room, complimenting the simple meal I'd prepared. She said all the right things. Asked polite questions. Laughed at James's stories with exactly the right timing. And yet, when James left to answer a phone call, her mask slipped. Just for a moment. She glanced around the apartment with barely concealed disdain, her gaze lingering on the worn furniture, the outdated wallpaper, the cheap prints on the walls. Then she caught me watching. The smile snapped back into place. "You have a lovely home, Mrs. Gilbert." "Thank you," I'd said quietly. "We've made do." Something cold flickered in her eyes. "James told me you used to be a lawyer." I was. "What happened?" It was the way she asked, not curious, but calculating. Like she was cataloging my weaknesses for future use. "I made powerful people uncomfortable," I'd said. She'd laughed lightly. "Well, I'm sure James is proud of you anyway." Anyway. As if being disbarred was something to overcome. As if my past was an embarrassment. I should have told James my concerns then. Should have pulled him aside and said, "Be careful. This woman wants something from you, and it isn't love." But I didn't. Because he was happy. Because after years of watching him work himself to exhaustion, building his business brick by brick, he'd finally found someone who made him smile. Because I was his mother, not his guardian, and he deserved to make his own choices. Even the wrong ones. The call came at 2:47 a.m. James's construction office, a warehouse on the industrial north side, was burning. By the time the fire department arrived, half the building was gone. James had been inside, working late on project bids, when the fire started. He barely made it out alive. The official report called it electrical failure. Faulty wiring in an old building. An unfortunate accident. But I knew buildings. I'd spent enough years reviewing construction cases to understand codes, safety standards, inspection records. James's warehouse had been inspected 6 months earlier. Everything had been up to code. More than that, James was meticulous. Obsessively so. He checked and rechecked every system in that building personally. Electrical failure didn't make sense. And then there was the insurance. 3 weeks before the fire, Wanda had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on James. She'd mentioned it casually at Sunday dinner, framing it as responsible financial planning for married couples. I'd felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, but I'd said nothing. 3 weeks later, James was in the ICU with third-degree burns and a shattered pelvis from falling debris. I'd sat beside his hospital bed, watching him sleep through the haze of morphine, and I'd known with absolute certainty. Someone had tried to kill my son. And his wife was involved. But knowing and proving were two different things. I'd learned that lesson 20 years ago, when I'd had evidence and still lost everything. This time, I would need more than evidence. I would need a confession. Marcus Dunfield's voice pulled me back to the present. "Mrs. Bennet, can you describe your husband's condition after the accident?" Wanda's expression shifted to somber compassion. He was in constant pain. Physically and emotionally. He couldn't work. Couldn't sleep. Some days, he couldn't even get out of bed. "And how did that affect your marriage?" "It destroyed it." Her voice broke beautifully. "I tried to be supportive. I took care of him. Managed the finances. But he pushed me away. Blamed me for things that weren't my fault. The man I loved disappeared, and someone bitter and angry took his place." Beside me, James flinched. His hand tightened on the armrest. I placed my hand over his, squeezing gently. "She's performing," I whispered. "Let her. Every lie makes our truth stronger." Marcus continued, "Did there come a point when you realized the marriage couldn't be saved?" "Yes." Wanda straightened slightly, steel entering her voice. "When he refused to even discuss selling the house to pay for his medical bills. When he accused me of," she stopped, as if the words were too painful to speak. "Accused you of what, Mrs. Bennet?" "Of wanting him to die." The tears came harder now. "He said I'd married him for money. That I was waiting for him to." She covered her face with her hands. It was a masterful performance. Even I might have believed it, if I hadn't known better. Judge Franklin's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening of his jaw. He was listening, evaluating, weighing. Marcus let the moment breathe, then said softly, "No further questions, Your Honor." "Mr. Bennett," Judge Franklin said, turning to our table. "Do you wish to cross-examine?" James started to rise, but I touched his arm again. "Your Honor," I said, standing instead. "May I confer with my son briefly?" Judge Franklin nodded. 5 minutes. I leaned close to James, my voice barely audible. "Don't respond to her emotionally. That's what they want. Let Marcus think he's winning. Let Wanda believe her performance worked. Mom, I can't just sit here and..." My phone vibrated in my pocket. I'd silenced it before entering the courtroom, setting it to allow calls only from emergency contacts. There were only 3 people on that list. I glanced at the screen. Martin Cruz. My heart rate spiked. "I need to take this," I murmured to James. "Now?" I met his eyes. "Trust me." I stood, approaching the bench. "Your Honor, I apologize, but I need to step out briefly. It's urgent." Judge Franklin frowned. "Mrs. Gilbert, we're in the middle of..." "I understand, Your Honor. I wouldn't ask if it weren't critical to this case." Something in my tone must have reached him, the echo of our shared past, perhaps, or the weight of old trust. He hesitated, then nodded. 10 minutes. Not a second more. I stepped into the hallway, the courtroom doors closing behind me with a heavy thud. The corridor was empty except for a young couple waiting on a bench, speaking in hushed, anxious tones. I answered the call. "Martin." "Helena." His voice was tight with urgency. "You were right about the fire. I found the accelerant purchase records. Victor Lang bought industrial quantities of kerosene 2 days before James's warehouse burned. He used a shell company, but I traced it through 3 layers. My hand tightened on the phone. That's not enough for criminal charges. We need. There's more. I heard papers rustling. I pulled Wanda's phone records. The night of the fire, she received 7 calls from Lang. 7. The last one came 18 minutes before the 911 call reporting the blaze. The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. She knew, I breathed. She knew it was happening. Worse. Martin's voice dropped. I found text messages between them. "Helena, they planned it. All of it. The insurance, the fire, the divorce. They've been moving money offshore for 8 months. By the time this divorce finalizes, they plan to be in the Cayman Islands with over $2 million. $2 million. My son's life insurance policy. The house. The business assets. All of it liquidated, laundered, and stolen. Can you get me the records?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "Already done. I'm emailing everything to you now." "Helena," he paused. "This is attempted murder. Fraud. Conspiracy. You need to take this to the police." "I will," I said. "But first, I need to finish what I started." I ended the call and opened my email. The files loaded slowly, phone records, financial transfers, text message transcripts. And there, in black and white, was Wanda's voice. "Is it done? Warehouse is lit. He's inside. Won't be long now. Good. Make sure it looks like an accident." I stood in that empty hallway, holding evidence that would destroy Wanda Bennett and send her to prison. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt the same cold fury I'd felt 20 years ago, when I'd learned that justice could be bought and sold by men with enough money and power. Some people thought the law was broken. I knew better. The law wasn't broken. It was weaponized. And the only way to fight a weapon was with a better one. I had mine now. I straightened my jacket, smoothed my hair, and walked back toward the courtroom doors. Inside, Wanda was probably still playing the wounded wife. Marcus was probably congratulating himself on his performance. They thought they'd already won. They had no idea what was coming. The cafe was the kind of place where people came to disappear: dim lighting, booths with high backs, and a clientele that knew better than to ask questions. I sat in the corner farthest from the door, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. Martin Cruz slid into the booth across from me, looking exactly as I remembered: sharp eyes, graying hair cropped military short, and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades digging through other people's secrets. "Helena." He set a manila envelope on the table between us. "It's worse than we thought." I'd met Martin 23 years ago, when he was still with the FBI's white-collar crime division and I was building the corruption case that would end my career. He'd been the only federal agent willing to listen when I'd brought evidence of judicial bribery. He'd also been the only one who tried to protect me when the machine turned against us both. They transferred him to a field office in Omaha within a week of my disbarment. He'd resigned 6 months later and started his own private investigation firm. We'd stayed in touch, two casualties of the same war, waiting for another battle. "Show me," I said. He opened the envelope and spread the contents across the table like a hand of cards: printed emails, bank statements, photographs, and phone records. "Victor Lang," he said, tapping a photo of a man in his early 50s, handsome in that artificial way that came from expensive grooming and careful maintenance. "Real estate developer. Net worth around $15 million. Married twice, divorced twice, currently unattached. Or so his public profile claims." He slid over a series of photographs: Victor and Wanda at a restaurant, their hands intertwined across the table. Victor and Wanda entering a hotel. Victor and Wanda on what looked like a yacht, champagne glasses raised in a toast. The dates on the photos went back 2 years. 2 years. Before the fire. Before James's accident. While Wanda was still playing the devoted wife at Sunday dinners, asking me to pass the potatoes with that perfect smile. "They've been together longer than we thought," Martin continued. I traced their connection back 26 months. Started as a business relationship. Lang was consulting on a property development deal James's company was bidding on. "Let me guess," I said quietly. "James didn't get the contract." "No. But Wanda and Victor got each other." He pulled out a printout of email exchanges. "This is where it gets interesting. 6 months after they started their affair, they began planning the exit strategy." I scanned the emails, my hands steady despite the fury building in my chest. From Wanda Bennett to Victor Lang. Subject: timeline. "We need to be patient. Jay's company is finally profitable. Once the Riverside project closes, his assets will peak. That's when we move. Insurance first, then the accident, then the divorce. Clean. Simple. By next summer, we're in Grand Cayman." From Victor Lang to Wanda Bennett. Subject: timeline. "Agreed. I'll handle the warehouse. You handle the insurance and the grieving widow routine. Once he's out of the picture, everything gets liquidated. $2 million, minimum. Enough to start over properly." I set the email down carefully, as if it might detonate. "There's more," Martin said, sliding over bank records. 3 weeks before the fire, Wanda took out a $1.5 million life insurance policy on James. She forged his signature on the application. "Here," he pointed to a highlighted section. The beneficiary was originally listed as estate of James Bennett, but she amended it 2 days before the fire to list herself as sole beneficiary. "And the fire?" Martin's expression darkened. "Lang purchased industrial accelerants through a shell company registered in Delaware. The purchase was made 48 hours before James's warehouse burned. I've got the receipts, the shipping manifests, everything." He pulled out the final piece: phone records showing the 7 calls between Wanda and Victor the night of the fire. "The last call," Martin said, pointing to the timestamp, "was 18 minutes before the 911 call reporting the blaze. I got the text messages too." He handed me his phone. The messages were loaded on the screen. "Victor, 10:47 p.m. It's done. He's inside." "Wanda, 10:48 p.m. You're sure?" "Victor, 10:49 p.m. Fires spreading fast. Even if he gets out, the damage will be enough. Wanda, 10:51 p.m. Call me when it's confirmed. I stared at the messages, each word burning into my mind like acid. They hadn't just betrayed James. They'd tried to murder him. Martin leaned back, watching me carefully. Helena, this is beyond divorce court. This is attempted murder, insurance fraud, conspiracy. You need to take this to the Cook County DA immediately. I will, I said, my voice steady. But not yet. Helena. If I go to the DA now, it becomes a criminal investigation. That could take months, maybe years. In the meantime, Wanda gets to keep playing the victim. She'll claim she had no knowledge of Victor's actions. She'll say the affair was a mistake, that she never meant to hurt James. The evidence. The evidence will get her eventually, I interrupted. But James will still lose the house in the divorce while we wait for the criminal case to develop. She'll liquidate assets, hide money offshore, and by the time the DA moves, there'll be nothing left to recover. Martin's jaw tightened. So what's your play? I gathered the documents back into the envelope. I finish this in court. I expose her in front of a judge, on the record, with witnesses. I make her confess what she did. And then, I met his eyes. Then I hand her to the police with a signed admission and a room full of people who heard it. That's risky. I know. If you push too hard, her lawyer will object. If you introduce evidence without proper foundation, Franklin will shut you down. I know that too. I stood, sliding the envelope into my briefcase. But I'm not there as her lawyer, Martin. I'm there as a mother. And mothers don't have to follow the rules of evidence. He shook his head, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. The iron voice of justice. God, I missed watching you work. Let's hope I haven't gotten rusty. I found James in the living room of my apartment, staring at the wall with the hollow expression of someone who'd stopped believing in tomorrow. His cane leaned against the armrest of the chair. His hands lay limp in his lap. She was right, he said quietly as I entered. I'm not the man I was. I can't provide for anyone. Can't even provide for myself. I set my briefcase down and sat across from him. James. No, Mom. You saw her in court. You heard what she said. I am bitter. I am angry. Maybe she does deserve to start over with someone who isn't. He gestured vaguely at himself. This. The defeat in his voice broke something in me. I leaned forward, taking his hands in mine. Look at me. He wouldn't. James. Look at me. Finally, his eyes met mine. You gave her your heart, I said quietly. Every piece of it. You trusted her. Loved her. Built a life for her. And she took that gift and turned it into a weapon to destroy you. Maybe I deserved. Don't. My voice sharpened. Don't you dare finish that sentence. You didn't deserve any of this. The fire wasn't an accident, James. The timing wasn't coincidence. And Wanda's sudden decision to leave you wasn't because you changed. His brow furrowed. What are you saying? I'm saying she planned this. All of it. The insurance policy. The fire. The divorce. She and her lover tried to kill you, and when that failed, they decided to destroy you financially instead. The color drained from his face. Mom, that's insane. Wanda wouldn't. I have proof. I said it simply, letting the weight of those 3 words settle between us. Phone records. Emails. Bank transfers. Text messages from the night of the fire coordinating the attack. All of it. James stared at me, his mind visibly struggling to reconcile the woman he'd loved with the monster I was describing. Why, he finally whispered. Why would she do this? Money. $2 million, once your assets were liquidated. She and Victor Lang planned to disappear to the Cayman Islands and start over. Victor Lang? Recognition flickered in James's eyes. The developer? He was consulting on the Riverside project. Wanda said he stopped. She introduced us. She set up the meetings. She set up everything. I squeezed his hands. But here's what matters now, you didn't lose yourself, James. You were targeted. By someone who saw your success, your goodness, your trust, and decided to exploit all of it. Tears welled in his eyes. I loved her, Mom. I know, sweetheart. I know. How do I come back from this? I held his gaze, letting him see the steel that had carried me through my own destruction and survival. You gave her your heart, I repeated. Now I'm going to take back your dignity. And when I'm done, she'll wish she'd never heard the name Bennett. The second day of the hearing opened with Marcus Dunfield calling a parade of witnesses designed to paint James as incompetent, a psychiatrist who'd evaluated him once for insurance purposes, a former employee who testified about James's erratic behavior after the accident, even Wanda's mother, who dabbed her eyes while describing how worried she'd been about her daughter's safety. It was theater. Calculated, expensive theater. And it was working. I could see it in the way Judge Franklin took notes, in the sympathetic murmurs from the gallery, in the way the court reporter's expression softened when Wanda's mother described finding her daughter crying after James allegedly threw a glass against the wall. A lie. All of it. But convincing. Beside me, James slumped lower with each testimony, the weight of their manufactured narrative crushing him. I wrote notes. Stayed silent. Let them think they were winning. Marcus called his final witness, Dr. Richard Chen, a physician who'd treated James post-accident. Under Marcus's careful questioning, Dr. Chen described James's physical limitations, his dependence on pain medication, his inability to return to full-time work. In your professional opinion, Marcus asked, is Mr. Bennett capable of managing his own affairs? Well, that's a complex question. Yes or no, doctor? Dr. Chen hesitated. Given his current condition, I would recommend oversight, yes. The gallery murmured. Marcus smiled. No further questions. Judge Franklin looked at our table. Mr. Bennett, do you wish to cross-examine? This was the moment. I stood, holding a sealed envelope. Your Honor, before we proceed further, I'd like to submit a preliminary motion on behalf of the defense. Marcus shot to his feet. Objection. Mrs. Gilbert is not counsel of record. She can't submit. She can submit anything she wants as a party with standing, Judge Franklin said mildly. I'll decide whether to consider it. Approach, Mrs. Gilbert. I walked to the bench, aware of every eye in the courtroom following me. I handed Judge Franklin the envelope. Your Honor, I said quietly, this motion includes newly discovered evidence pertinent to this case. I'm requesting permission to introduce it and to call additional witnesses. Franklin opened the envelope. I watched his eyes move across the first page, the summary I'd prepared, outlining the conspiracy, the insurance fraud, the attempted murder. His expression didn't change, but his knuckles went white. He read for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Finally, he looked up. This is serious, Mrs. Gilbert. Yes, Your Honor. You understand the implications of what you're alleging? I do. He glanced toward Wanda, then back at me. Do you have evidence to support these claims? Substantial evidence, Your Honor. Phone records, financial documents, emails, and text messages. All authenticated and ready for submission. Marcus was at the bench now, his confidence wavering. Your Honor, I object to this entire. Mr. Dunfield, I haven't ruled yet. Franklin closed the envelope and tapped it thoughtfully against the bench. Mrs. Gilbert, I'm going to allow you to submit this evidence, but I'm warning you now, if this is anything less than what you claim, there will be consequences. I understand, Your Honor. And I'm going to require that all parties have access to this evidence before we proceed. I'm calling a recess until tomorrow morning. That gives everyone time to review what Mrs. Gilbert has submitted. We'll reconvene at 9 a.m. sharp. He looked directly at Wanda. I strongly suggest both parties use this time wisely. As the courtroom began to empty, I returned to the defense table. Wanda was staring at me, her perfect composure finally cracking. She leaned toward Marcus, whispering urgently, "What is she doing? What the hell is she doing?" I packed my briefcase slowly, deliberately. When I looked up, our eyes met across the aisle. For 20 years, I'd been silent. Disbarred. Dismissed. Erased. But I'd never been broken. And now, finally, I had what I'd lost 2 decades ago: evidence, truth, and a judge willing to listen. I held Wanda's panicked gaze and said, just loud enough for her to hear. "Finishing what I started 20 years ago." Her face went white. Behind her, I saw Victor Lang slip out the courtroom doors, his phone already pressed to his ear. They were scared. Good. They should be. Because tomorrow, the truth was coming for them. And this time, it wasn't asking permission. The courtroom felt different that morning, charged, electric, like the air before a storm. Judge Franklin took his seat with the deliberate gravity of a man who understood that what happened in the next few hours would define careers, destroy lives, and determine whether justice was still more than just a word carved into marble. He'd spent the night reviewing my evidence. I could see it in the tight set of his jaw, the careful neutrality of his expression, the face of a judge who discovered something he couldn't ignore. Marcus Dunfield sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, his expensive watch catching the light as he shuffled papers with barely controlled agitation. Wanda beside him looked pale beneath her makeup, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Victor Lang was nowhere to be seen. "This court is reconvened," Judge Franklin announced. "Before we proceed with witness testimony, I want to address the motion submitted yesterday by Mrs. Gilbert." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. "I've reviewed the preliminary evidence. Mr. Dunfield, I assume you've had the opportunity to do the same?" Marcus stood stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor. And I'd like to state for the record that my client categorically denies these baseless accusations. This appears to be nothing more than a desperate attempt to." "Your objection is noted." Franklin's tone was ice. "However, I'm going to allow Mrs. Gilbert to proceed. This evidence raises questions that deserve answers." He looked at me. "Mrs. Gilbert, you may continue." I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to recall Mrs. Bennett to the stand." Wanda's face went rigid. Marcus leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she was already rising, because refusing would look worse than complying. She walked to the witness stand like she was walking to a firing squad, her confident stride from yesterday replaced with careful, measured steps. When she sat, she smoothed her skirt with trembling hands. She was already breaking. "Mrs. Bennett," I began, my voice calm and conversational, "you testified yesterday that you and my son purchased your marital home together, correct?" "Yes." Her voice was steady, but I heard the effort it took. "And you stated that as part of the divorce settlement, you're requesting half the value of that property?" "That's correct." "When exactly did you and James purchase this home?" "4 years ago. In June." I walked to the evidence table and picked up a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Defense Exhibit A, the property deed for 2847 Ashland Avenue, the marital residence in question." Judge Franklin nodded. I approached the witness stand and handed Wanda the deed. "Mrs. Bennett, could you read the purchase date on that document?" She stared at the paper, her lips pressing into a thin line. "June 15, 2016. "And the year you married my son?" Silence. "Mrs. Bennett?" 2021, she said quietly. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Could you speak up?" 2021. Her voice cracked with frustration. "So this property was purchased 5 years before your marriage?" We, James and I discussed. "Yes or no, Mrs. Bennett?" "Yes, but..." "And if you look at the deed, whose name appears as the sole owner. Her jaw clenched. James Bennett. Not James and Wanda Bennett? Not joint tenancy? No. I took the deed back, letting the silence stretch. So to clarify, you're seeking half the value of a property you never owned, purchased before you were married, with funds you never contributed to. Marcus shot to his feet. Objection. Illinois is a marital property state. Assets acquired during. The property was acquired before the marriage, Your Honor, I said calmly. It's not marital property. It's my son's sole and separate property. Judge Franklin leaned back. I'm inclined to agree. The objection is overruled. Continue, Mrs. Gilbert. I turned back to Wanda, watching her perfect composure begin to fracture like ice under pressure. Let's talk about the life insurance policy you took out on my son. Her eyes widened fractionally. That was standard financial planning. A $1.5 million policy, taken out 3 weeks before a warehouse fire that nearly killed him. That seems like remarkable timing. It was coincidence. Was it coincidence that you amended the beneficiary designation 2 days before the fire to make yourself the sole beneficiary? The color drained from her face. I don't know what you're talking about. Defense Exhibit B, Your Honor. I submitted the insurance documents Martin had obtained. The amendment is right here, Mrs. Bennett. Your signature. Dated 2 days before the fire. Marcus was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is outrageous speculation. Is it speculation, Mr. Dunfield? I turned to face him. Or is it evidence? Because I have phone records, text messages, and bank transfers that tell a very different story about that fire. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Franklin's gavel cracked like thunder. Order. Mr. Dunfield, sit down. Mrs. Gilbert, approach the bench. Now. As I walked toward the bench, my mind flashed back to another courtroom, another judge, another moment when everything hung in the balance. I'd been standing at this same bench, 20 years younger but infinitely more naive, holding evidence of corruption that I'd believed would change everything. Judge Morrison, now dead, his legacy buried with the secrets he protected, had looked at me with cold contempt. Mrs. Gilbert, these accusations are serious. You're alleging that members of this court have engaged in criminal conduct. Do you understand the consequences if you're wrong? I understand the consequences if I'm right, Your Honor. And I'm not wrong. But I had been wrong about one thing. I'd believed the system would protect me if I followed the rules. Robert Franklin had been there that day, a young clerk, fresh from law school, sitting at a side table taking notes. I'd seen the shock in his eyes when they'd turned on me, the disbelief as they'd twisted my evidence into proof of my own corruption. He'd approached me after the hearing, in the empty hallway, his voice low and urgent. Mrs. Gilbert, what they did to you, it's not right. I know the truth. I know what you found. Then why didn't you speak up? I'd asked, too exhausted for anger. I'm nobody. A clerk. They'd destroy me too. I'd looked at his young, earnest face and felt something break inside me. Not bitterness. Understanding. Then survive, I'd told him. Climb. Learn. And when you have the power to make a difference, use it. I'd never known if he'd remembered that conversation. Until yesterday, when he'd recognized me and whispered my name like a prayer and an apology combined. Your Honor, I said quietly, aware that Marcus was beside me, radiating fury. I have additional evidence that directly connects Mrs. Bennett to a conspiracy to defraud and harm my son. These are criminal allegations, Franklin said, his voice pitched for our ears only. If you have evidence of criminal conduct, you need to. I've already contacted the Cook County DA's office, I said. They're reviewing the case. But this is still a divorce proceeding, and my son deserves to know the truth about the woman he married before he loses everything he built. Franklin's eyes held mine. In them, I saw the ghost of that young clerk who'd wanted to help but couldn't. Now he could. Present your evidence, he said. But Mrs. Gilbert, it better be everything you claim. It is, Your Honor. Franklin called a 15-minute recess to review the new exhibits. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators filing out to gossip in the halls, lawyers checking phones, James sitting silently beside our table. I walked to the water fountain, needing a moment to steady myself before the final push. I didn't hear her approach. You think you're clever, don't you? I turned. Wanda stood 3 feet away, her perfect mask finally shattered. Rage and desperation burned in her eyes. You think you're so clever, old woman, she hissed, stepping closer. Everyone knows what you are. Everyone knows you were thrown out of law for corruption. You're nothing. A disgraced has been trying to relive her glory days. I met her fury with absolute calm. The difference between us, Wanda, I said quietly, is that I was punished for telling the truth. And you will be punished for lying. You can't prove anything. Can't I? I smiled slightly. I have your text messages to Victor Lang the night of the fire. I have the insurance amendment with your forged signature. I have bank transfers showing you've been moving money offshore for 8 months. I have emails detailing your plan to murder my son for insurance money. Her face went ashen. You're bluffing. Am I? I leaned closer. Here's what's going to happen, Wanda. You're going to go back into that courtroom. You're going to sit in that witness chair. And you're going to watch everything you built crumble to dust. Then the police are going to arrest you. And you're going to spend the next 20 years in prison thinking about the man you tried to destroy. I'll tell them you fabricated. You can tell them whatever you want. My voice dropped to barely a whisper. But I have one more piece of evidence you don't know about. Something even Victor doesn't know I have. Fear flickered across her face. What? You'll find out. In court. In front of everyone. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing by the fountain, her hands shaking, her perfect world collapsing around her. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. Word had spread. The gallery was packed, reporters, curious lawyers, courthouse staff who'd heard that something explosive was happening in courtroom 4. Judge Franklin took his seat. Mrs. Gilbert, you may proceed. I stood, holding a small digital recorder. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Defense Exhibit F, an audio recording obtained legally by a licensed private investigator, Martin Cruz, who is present in the courtroom and available to testify to its authenticity. Marcus shot up. Your Honor, we haven't had time to review. The recording was included in the evidence packet I submitted yesterday, I said calmly. If counsel failed to review all the materials, that's not the court's concern. Franklin nodded. Overruled. Play the recording, Mrs. Gilbert. I pressed play. The courtroom filled with Wanda's voice, crystal clear, recorded 1 week ago when Martin had followed her to a coffee shop where she'd met Victor Lang. Can't believe that idiot is still fighting this. Once James signs the settlement, we're done. Victor already found a buyer for the house. We can close everything by August. Victor's voice, what about his mother? Wanda's laugh, sharp and cruel, that pathetic old woman. She's nothing. She was disbarred 20 years ago for corruption. Nobody's going to listen to anything she says. James certainly doesn't. He thinks she's just being paranoid. And if she makes trouble? She won't. She can't. She's powerless. And even if she tried something, who would believe her? A disgraced lawyer with an axe to grind against her son's wife? Please. Silence in the courtroom. Absolute, suffocating silence. Then Wanda's voice again, quieter now, almost wistful. By September, we'll be in Grand Cayman with $2 million and James will still be stuck in that apartment, wondering what happened. Honestly, Victor, it's almost too easy. I stopped the recording. The silence stretched for 5 heartbeats. Then chaos. Reporters surging forward. Spectators gasping. Marcus standing frozen, his face pale. And Wanda, Wanda sitting in the witness chair, tears streaming down her face, but not tears of remorse. Tears of rage and trapped desperation. Judge Franklin's gavel cracked like gunfire. Order. Order in this court. When silence finally returned, he looked at Wanda with an expression I'd never seen on a judge's face, pure, undisguised contempt. Mrs. Bennet, he said coldly, I'm going to ask you one question, and I strongly suggest you consider your answer carefully. Do you wish to recant any of your previous testimony? Wanda's mouth opened, then closed. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she pushed him away. That recording was taken without my consent, she said, her voice shaking. It's illegal. Illinois is a one-party consent state, I said. The recording is perfectly legal. Franklin leaned forward. Mrs. Bennet, answer the question. Do you wish to recant your testimony? She looked at me, hatred burning in her eyes. Then she looked at James, my son, sitting at the defense table, his face a mask of devastated realization. And she said the only thing she could say. I want to speak to my attorney. Franklin's expression didn't change. This hearing is adjourned. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Bennet to a private conference room. Mr. Dunfield, you have 1 hour to confer with your client. When we return, Mrs. Bennet will answer every question Mrs. Gilbert has, or she will face contempt charges. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice hollow. As the bailiff led Wanda away, she turned back one last time, her eyes finding mine. I held her gaze. And smiled. The trap had closed. The hour passed like a held breath. I sat with James in the empty hallway outside the courtroom, watching him process the full weight of Wanda's betrayal. He didn't speak. Didn't cry. He just stared at his hands, turning his wedding ring slowly around his finger. Finally, he pulled it off. I should have seen it, he said quietly. No. I placed my hand over his. You loved her. Love makes us vulnerable. That's not weakness, James. That's humanity. She tried to kill me, Mom. I know. For money. I know. He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. How do I come back from this? I held his gaze. One day at a time. One step at a time. The same way you learn to walk again after the fire. The bailiff appeared in the doorway. Court is resuming. The courtroom was even more packed than before. Word had spread through the courthouse like wildfire, the iron voice of justice is back, and she's destroying someone. Lawyers crowded the gallery. Law students pressed against the walls. Even a few judges had slipped in to watch. Wanda sat at the plaintiff's table, her composure reconstructed but fragile, like a porcelain vase glued back together, the cracks still visible. Marcus Dunfield sat rigidly beside her, his earlier confidence replaced with the grim determination of a lawyer who knew he was losing but had to fight anyway. Judge Franklin entered, and the room fell silent. This court is back in session. He settled into his seat, his expression unreadable. Mr. Dunfield, I understand you've conferred with your client. Does Mrs. Bennet wish to make a statement? Marcus stood. Your Honor, my client maintains that the recording played earlier was taken out of context and... Out of context? I rose, my voice cutting across his. Your Honor, may I submit Defense Exhibit G, the complete, unedited recording. 22 minutes of Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Victor Lang discussing in explicit detail their plan to defraud my son. I held up a flash drive. I can play the entire conversation if the court wishes. It includes discussion of insurance fraud, property transfers, offshore accounts, and, most damningly, their acknowledgement that the warehouse fire was deliberately set while my son was inside. The courtroom erupted. Reporters stood, trying to get closer. Spectators gasped. Franklin's gavel came down hard. Order. Sit down, all of you, or I'll clear this courtroom. When silence returned, he looked at Marcus. Does your client wish to respond to these allegations? Wanda leaned toward Marcus, whispering urgently. He shook his head. She whispered more insistently. Finally, he stood. Mrs. Bennet would like to address the court directly, Your Honor. Franklin's eyebrows rose. Against your advice, counselor? Yes, Your Honor. Very well. Mrs. Bennet, you may speak. But I remind you that you're still under oath. Wanda stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. When she spoke, her voice carried a desperate edge. Your Honor, I admit that I had a relationship with Victor Lang. I admit that was wrong. But everything else, the fire, the insurance, the plan to steal from James, that was all Victor. I didn't know what he was doing. I was manipulated, used. That's a lie. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The words carried across the courtroom like a blade. Wanda whirled to face me. You don't know. I know exactly what you did. I approached the evidence table, picking up another document. Defense Exhibit H, bank records showing transfers from your personal account to Victor Lang's shell company. $47,000, paid in 6 installments over 8 months. The memo line on each transfer reads, Project Consulting. I handed the records to the bailiff, who passed them to Judge Franklin. If you were being manipulated, Mrs. Bennet, why were you paying him? Her mouth opened, then closed. And Defense Exhibit I held up another document. The life insurance application. The signature authorizing the policy is yours. The forged signature pretending to be my son's is also yours. I had a handwriting expert compare it to your known signatures. You didn't just know about the insurance fraud, Mrs. Bennet. You executed it. Marcus was on his feet. Your Honor, this is. Sit down, Mr. Dunfield. Franklin's voice was cold steel. I want to hear this. I turned back to Wanda, watching her perfect facade crack further with each word. You want to claim you were manipulated? That you didn't know? I stepped closer. Then explain the text message you sent Victor Lang at 11:14 p.m. on the night of the fire, 18 minutes after the fire started, asking, is he dead yet? Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Wanda's face went white. That's not, I didn't. You did. I held up the phone records. The text is right here. Time-stamped. Authenticated by the phone company. Submitted to the Cook County District Attorney this morning. She staggered slightly, gripping the table for support. You didn't ask if he was safe, I continued, my voice quiet but relentless. You didn't ask if he got out. You asked if he was dead. Because that was the plan, wasn't it? The fire was supposed to kill him. The insurance policy would pay out. You and Victor would take the money and disappear. No. Wanda's voice cracked, hysteria bleeding through. You're twisting everything. You're a liar, you've always been a liar. Everyone knows what you are. She turned to face the gallery, her composure completely shattered. This woman was disbarred for corruption. She was thrown out of law for lying, for fabricating evidence, for... Enough. Judge Franklin's voice cut through her tirade like a thunderclap. Wanda fell silent, breathing hard. Franklin stood, and the weight of his presence filled the courtroom. Mrs. Bennet, I will not allow you to impugn Mrs. Gilbert's character in my courtroom. Especially not with lies. But she was disbarred. She was disbarred, Franklin said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, for having the courage to expose corruption in the Cook County judiciary. I know, because I was there. The courtroom went absolutely still. 23 years ago, I was a clerk in this building. Helena Gilbert brought evidence, irrefutable, documented evidence, that 3 sitting judges were taking bribes, fixing cases, selling verdicts to the highest bidder. He looked at me, and I saw something I'd waited 2 decades to see, public acknowledgement of the truth. Instead of investigating the judges she exposed, Franklin continued, the system turned on her. They fabricated ethics charges. They seized her files. They destroyed her reputation and stripped her license, all to protect men who were corrupt to their core. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. For the record, Franklin said, his voice ringing with authority, Helena Gilbert was the finest attorney I ever knew. Her integrity was, and is, unimpeachable. And I have regretted my silence during her persecution every day since. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Franklin turned his gaze back to Wanda, and his expression hardened. You, Mrs. Bennet, are not fit to speak her name. Wanda stood trembling, her last defense stripped away. Marcus had his head in his hands. The gallery was silent, watching the collapse of a woman who'd thought herself untouchable. Your Honor, I said quietly, I have one final piece of evidence. Franklin nodded. Proceed. I returned to the evidence table and picked up a folder I'd kept separate from the others. Inside were documents I'd obtained from Martin just this morning, the final pieces of the puzzle. Defense Exhibit J, Insurance Investigation Reports from the Warehouse Fire. The fire marshal's initial report concluded electrical failure, but that conclusion was reached within 48 hours. Suspiciously fast for a fire of that magnitude. I opened the folder, revealing photographs of the burn patterns, chemical analysis reports, and investigator notes. I hired an independent fire investigator to review the evidence. His conclusion: the fire was set using industrial accelerant, poured in a pattern designed to trap anyone in the northwest corner of the building, exactly where my son's office was located. I held up a photograph showing the char patterns. Defense Exhibit K, purchase records showing Victor Lang bought 60 gallons of kerosene 2 days before the fire, using a shell company registered in Delaware. Marcus stood weakly. Your Honor, this is a criminal matter. It doesn't belong in a divorce proceeding. It belongs exactly here, I interrupted. Because this divorce proceeding was always part of the crime. The fire was supposed to kill James and trigger the insurance payout. When he survived, Wanda shifted to Plan B, divorce him, take everything he owned, and disappear with Victor anyway. I turned to face Wanda directly. You didn't love my son. You never did. You saw a successful, trusting man, and you decided to destroy him for profit. You tried to burn him alive. When that failed, you tried to break him emotionally and financially. You stood in this courtroom and called him worthless, knowing you were the one who crippled him. My voice remained steady, but I let the full weight of my contempt show. You're not a victim, Mrs. Bennet. You're a predator. And today, your hunting days are over. Something snapped in Wanda. She lunged toward me, her face twisted with rage. You're nothing, she screamed. Nothing. A washed-up, pathetic old woman trying to relive your glory days. You lost everything, your career, your husband, your dignity, and you want to drag me down because you can't stand seeing someone else succeed. The bailiff moved to intercept her, but I held up my hand. I didn't need protection from Wanda's tantrum. I stood perfectly still, meeting her wild eyes with absolute calm. You're right, I said quietly. I did lose everything. I took a step toward her. I lost my career because I exposed criminals who wore robes and called themselves judges. I lost my husband because he valued comfort over truth. I lost my reputation because powerful men decided it was easier to destroy one woman than reform a corrupt system. Another step. But do you know what I didn't lose, Wanda? I was directly in front of her now, close enough to see the fear beneath her rage. My integrity. My son. My ability to recognize evil when I see it. I leaned closer. And my memory of how to destroy people like you. She flinched. I lost everything because I refused to lie, I said, my voice ringing through the courtroom. Today, I stand here to remind you, and everyone in this room, that justice may stumble, but it never falls. It may be delayed, corrupted, buried beneath lies and power. But eventually, it returns. I stepped back, my voice rising with the weight of 2 decades of silence finally broken. And when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. The courtroom had gone silent. Even Wanda had stopped screaming, staring at me with something that might have been recognition, the realization that she'd picked a fight with the wrong woman. Judge Franklin's voice cut through the silence. "Mrs. Bennet, sit down. Now." She collapsed into her chair, Marcus gripping her arm to steady her. Franklin looked at the gallery, his expression grave. "I've sat on this bench for 15 years. I've presided over hundreds of divorce cases. I've seen greed, betrayal, and cruelty in forms that would shock decent people." He paused. "But I have never seen evidence of attempted murder presented in a dissolution proceeding." He turned his gaze to Wanda, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the silence, every word carried like a verdict. "Mrs. Bennet, I am referring this case to the Cook County District Attorney for immediate criminal investigation. Furthermore, I am issuing an emergency order freezing all assets currently in your name or control, pending resolution of fraud charges." Wanda made a strangled sound. "As for this divorce proceeding," Franklin looked at James. "Mr. Bennet, do you wish to proceed with the dissolution of your marriage?" James stood slowly, using his cane for support. When he spoke, his voice was stronger than I'd heard it in months. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then I'm granting your petition. The marriage is dissolved effective immediately. All property, assets, and accounts are confirmed as your sole and separate property. Mrs. Bennet's petition for asset division is denied in its entirety." The gavel fell. "Furthermore," Franklin continued, "I'm awarding attorney's fees and costs to Mr. Bennet, to be paid by Mrs. Bennet upon resolution of the criminal charges. Which, given the evidence I've seen, I expect will result in a significant prison sentence." He stood, gathering his robes. "This court stands in recess pending my written order. Bailiff, please ensure Mrs. Bennet remains available for law enforcement." As Franklin stepped down from the bench, he paused beside me. "The iron voice of justice," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. "Welcome back, Helena." Then he was gone. The courtroom erupted. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Lawyers congratulated each other. Spectators buzzed with excitement. I ignored all of it. I walked to James, who stood at the defense table, tears streaming down his face. "It's over," he whispered. "No." I pulled him into an embrace. "It's beginning. You're free now. Free to rebuild. Free to become who you were meant to be. I don't know who that is anymore. Then we'll figure it out together." Across the courtroom, police officers had arrived. They approached Wanda, who sat frozen, staring at nothing. "Mrs. Wanda Bennet," one officer said. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent." As they read her rights, she turned to look at me one last time. I held her gaze. And I smiled. Not with triumph. With finality. Justice, delayed for 20 years, had finally come home. The written order arrived 3 days later. I sat in my small apartment, the morning sun streaming through the window, the kind of clean, golden light that follows a storm. The envelope bore the Cook County Circuit Court seal, official and final. Inside, Judge Robert Franklin's verdict was typed in the formal language of law, but I could hear his voice in every word. After careful review of all evidence submitted, including documentary evidence, audio recordings, financial records, and expert testimony, this court finds overwhelming and incontrovertible evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and criminal misconduct by Respondent Wanda Marie Bennet. The respondent's petition for division of marital assets is denied in its entirety. All properties, accounts, and assets are hereby confirmed as the sole and separate property of petitioner James Michael Bennet. Furthermore, this court finds that the marriage between the parties was entered into and maintained through fraudulent misrepresentation and with criminal intent. The dissolution is granted with prejudice. The matter of insurance fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy is hereby referred to the Cook County District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution. It is so ordered. Below the typed text, Judge Franklin had added a handwritten note. Helena, justice delayed is not justice denied. Thank you for reminding me why I became a lawyer. RF. I folded the order carefully and placed it back in the envelope. 20 years of silence. 20 years of carrying the weight of truth that no one wanted to hear. And now, finally, vindication. Not just for James. For me. I didn't attend Wanda's arraignment. I'd done what I needed to do. The rest belonged to the criminal justice system, and for once, I trusted it to work. But Martin Cruz called me afterward, his voice carrying grim satisfaction. She tried to plead not guilty, he said. Her new lawyer, a public defender, since she's been frozen out of all her money, tried to argue the evidence was circumstantial. The judge laughed. Actually laughed. And Victor Lang? Arrested in Miami trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. They found $800,000 in cash in his luggage. He's facing the same charges, plus flight risk. No bail. I closed my eyes, feeling something release in my chest, a knot I'd been carrying since the night James called me from the hospital, his voice broken, telling me about the fire. What are they offering her? I asked. 20 years if she pleads guilty and testifies against Lang. 40 if she goes to trial and loses. Her lawyer's recommending the plea. Will she take it? Martin was silent for a moment. I don't know. She's still claiming she's the victim. Still insisting you fabricated everything. Let her claim whatever she wants, I said quietly. The evidence speaks for itself. That it does. Martin paused. Helena, you did good. Real good. I'm proud of you. My throat tightened. I couldn't have done it without you, Martin. Yes, you could have. You're the iron voice of justice. You were just waiting for the right moment to speak again. James had moved out of the house he'd shared with Wanda. Too many memories, he said. Too many ghosts. Instead, he'd found a small loft in a converted warehouse downtown, industrial, open, filled with light. It suited him. A place to start over. I helped him unpack boxes, organizing his kitchen while he assembled furniture with the careful deliberation of someone relearning how to build a life. I got a call from the insurance company, he said, not looking up from the bookshelf he was constructing. They're paying out the full claim for the warehouse fire. Plus damages for the fraudulent policy Wanda took out. That's good. It's more than good, Mom. It's enough to restart the business. Hire back the crew I had to let go. Maybe even expand. I heard the hope in his voice, fragile, tentative, but real. Are you going to do it? I asked. He set down his screwdriver and looked at me. I don't know if I can. Every time I think about going back, I remember the fire. I remember waking up in the hospital and hearing Wanda's voice, so concerned, so loving, and now I know it was all an act. She wanted me dead, Mom. How do I come back from that? I crossed the room and sat beside him on the floor, our backs against the half-assembled bookshelf. You come back the same way I did, I said. One day at a time. One choice at a time. You decide that what they tried to take from you, your livelihood, your trust, your belief in goodness, those things are worth fighting for. You never went back to law. No. I didn't. I looked around his new apartment, seeing the parallel, a new space, a fresh start, the possibility of becoming something different. But I never stopped being a lawyer in here. I tapped my chest. The law isn't what they let you practice. It's what you believe in. And I never stopped believing in justice. James's eyes were wet. I want to believe again, Mom. I want to believe people are good. That trust isn't foolish. That love is real. Then believe it. I took his hand. Wanda was one person. One liar in a world full of honest people. One predator in a world full of protectors. Don't let her steal your faith in humanity. How do I know who to trust? You listen. You watch. You learn. I squeezed his hand. And you remember that being hurt doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. The strongest people I've ever known are the ones who've been broken and chose to heal anyway. He leaned his head against my shoulder, and for a moment, he was my little boy again, the one who'd asked me why I kept fighting for justice when the world seemed determined to crush it. And I gave him the same answer I'd given then. Because someone has to. The rain had stopped. I stood outside the Cook County Courthouse, the same building where I'd been disbarred 23 years ago, where I'd lost everything, where I'd walked out into a cold November rain and wondered if I'd ever find my way back. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. The air smelled clean, washed, renewed. Behind me, the courthouse doors opened. James emerged, moving more steadily now, his cane more for confidence than necessity. Physical therapy had helped. But more than that, purpose had helped. He'd restarted his business. Hired back his crew. Taken on a new project, rebuilding a community center in the neighborhood where we'd lived when he was young. All set? I asked. All set. He smiled, a real smile, the first I'd seen in over a year. The permits are approved. We break ground next month. We walked together down the courthouse steps, past the place where I'd once stood alone, disgraced and broken. But I wasn't alone anymore. And I wasn't broken. Mom, James said as we reached the street. I never thanked you. For what? For fighting. For not giving up. For being stronger than I ever knew a person could be. I stopped walking and turned to face him. James, you gave me something too. What? A reason to speak again. I touched his face gently. I spent 20 years in silence because I thought my voice didn't matter anymore. That I'd been erased. But when Wanda tried to destroy you, I remembered, my voice never belonged to the Bar Association. It never belonged to the judges who tried to silence me. It belonged to me. And to the people I love. Tears spilled down his cheeks. I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. We stood on that sidewalk, in the shadow of the courthouse that had once been my enemy, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 decades. Peace. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Helena, it's Martin. The jury came back. Guilty on all counts. Wanda got 35 years. Victor got 40. I sat down slowly, the phone pressed to my ear. She rejected the plea deal, Martin continued. Insisted she was innocent until the end. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. The foreman said it would have been faster, but they wanted to review everything carefully. They didn't want any chance of appeal. Thank you, Martin. There's something else. He paused. The DA called me this morning. They're reopening your disbarment case. They found evidence that the ethics charges against you were fabricated by one of the judges you exposed. He's dead now, but his files were preserved. They want to reinstate your license, Helena. My breath caught. You'd have to take a refresher course, pass the bar again, but you'd be a lawyer again. Officially. I looked around my small apartment, at the quiet life I'd built in the years since everything fell apart. I thought about the peace I'd found, the relationship with my son I'd rebuilt, the knowledge that I'd won the fight that mattered most. Tell them thank you, I said quietly. But no. Helena. I don't need their permission anymore, Martin. I don't need their approval or their reinstatement. I know who I am. I know what I did was right. And I proved it in the only court that matters, the one where truth still wins. He was silent for a long moment. You're sure? I'm sure. Then what will you do? I smiled. I'm going to have dinner with my son. I'm going to watch him build something beautiful out of the ashes. And I'm going to know that when it mattered most, I didn't stay silent. The iron voice of justice, Martin said softly. No, I corrected. Just a mother who refused to let her son be destroyed. I stood at the dedication ceremony for James's rebuilt community center, watching him cut the ribbon while a crowd of neighbors cheered. Children played in the new playground. Teenagers gathered around the basketball courts. Families lined up to tour the facility. He'd built it from nothing, from the ashes of his old business, from the settlement money, from the determination to create something good out of something terrible. Just like I'd taught him. A reporter approached me, notebook in hand. "Mrs. Gilbert? I'm writing a story about your son's recovery. Can I ask you a few questions?" "Of course." "How does it feel, watching him rebuild after everything that happened?" I looked at James, laughing with a group of kids, his cane resting against the wall, present, but not needed. "It feels," I said slowly, "like justice. Some people are calling you a hero. The woman who exposed a murderer and saved her son." "I'm not a hero," I said. "I'm just someone who refused to accept that evil wins. Someone who remembered that truth may falter, but it never falls." The reporter scribbled in her notebook. "One more question, would you do it again? Fight that battle? Risk everything?" I didn't hesitate. For my son? For truth? For justice? I met her eyes. Every single time. I sat by my window that night, a cup of tea cooling in my hands. The city lights stretched out before me, thousands of lives unfolding in thousands of windows. Somewhere out there, Wanda sat in a prison cell, still insisting she was innocent. Somewhere out there, Victor Lang counted the years until he'd be free. And somewhere out there, other Wandas and Victors were planning their own schemes, targeting their own victims. But also out there, people were fighting back. Mothers were protecting their children. Lawyers were exposing corruption. Ordinary people were choosing truth over comfort. The world wasn't fixed. Evil still existed. But so did justice. And sometimes, that was enough. I thought about Judge Franklin's note, "Justice delayed is not justice denied." I thought about James's smile at the ribbon cutting. I thought about the 20 years of silence, and the moment I'd chosen to speak again. And I realized something. I hadn't lost everything 20 years ago. I'd lost the appearance of everything, the title, the office, the public respect. But I'd kept what mattered, my integrity, my love for my son, my belief that truth was worth fighting for. And in the end, that was the only victory that counted. The sun rose the next morning, golden, warm, full of promise. I opened my window, letting the fresh air fill my small apartment. Somewhere in the city, James was probably already at the community center, overseeing repairs, greeting neighbors, building the life he deserved. Somewhere in the city, the wheels of justice were still turning, slowly, imperfectly, but moving. And somewhere in the city, someone was preparing to fight for truth, just like I had. The iron voice of justice. They could call me whatever they wanted. But I knew who I really was. A mother who'd refused to let her son be destroyed. A woman who'd learned that silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. And a survivor who'd proven that justice may stumble, may be delayed, may be buried beneath lies and power. But it never, ever falls. Not while people like us are willing to fight for it. I picked up my phone and texted James. "Proud of you. Proud of us. Ready for whatever comes next." His response came immediately. "Love you, Mom. Thank you for teaching me that broken things can be rebuilt stronger." I smiled, set down my phone, and looked out at the city one more time. The courthouse stood in the distance, its dome catching the morning light. 23 years ago, I'd walked out of that building defeated. Yesterday, I'd walked out victorious. But the real victory wasn't the verdict or the vindication. It was knowing that when the world tried to silence me, I'd found my voice again. And I'd used it to save the person who mattered most. That was justice. That was redemption. That was enough.